Holy words, long preserved for our walk in this world, they resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart.
In this session of Echoes of Eternity, our journey through Scripture, we will survey the book of Esther. My name's Douglas Marquardt. Esther is about courage in difficult times. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Esther is part of the Megillot, which means scrolls. Now, Esther is read during the Feast of Purim, which happens on the 14th or the 15th day of Adar, which is primarily somewhere in the month of February or March. One of the interesting facts about the book of Esther is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is an ancient library of biblical books and other ancient writings, which was discovered in 1947, contain all of the Old Testament except for Esther. As we said, it's mainly read during the season, the Feast of Purim. What is Purim? The word Pur is an Akkadian word, which is the language of ancient Babylon and Assyria. The biblical writer explains that the word Pur means lot. The story is about a man named Haman who casts lots in order to choose a day on which the Jews would be destroyed. However, God's plans were different. Instead of destroying the Jews, God chose that day to deliver them and grant them victory. The Feast of Purim derives its name from this word. As we begin our survey with the purpose of the book of Esther, we discover the story of Esther, who is an orphan, a Jewish girl who is thrown into a world of political intrigue and power that plays out in the Persian court in Susa. Esther became a queen and had to make choices that required much courage and faith. Now, the book offers reassurance that even when God seems to be absent from our world or suffering, he is ever present, interested, and ready to act. The book affirms in narrative form what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 8:28, where he says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Another important purpose is establishing the celebration of Purim. This feast celebrates God's deliverance and of his people from Haman's evil plans. The book of Esther breaks into three main parts. We have the introduction, or the setting and the characters, in chapters 1 and 2. And we have a story of banquets, plots, and survival in chapter 3 through chapter 9:19. And then we have the story of the celebration of Purim from chapter 9:20 through 10:3. And here in this we read about the Feast of Purim and all that happens to the people of Israel. As to the background of the book of Esther, well, the author of the book is unknown. However, we can say that whoever wrote the book demonstrates first-hand knowledge of the Persian court. This suggests the author could have been a Jew in exile around the time the events happened. The date of the book is also unknown. However, we can narrow it down to the time of writing to the period between Xerxes I, somewhere between 486 to 465 BC, and the fall of the Persian Empire to Alexander the Great in 31 BC. The setting lets us know that the events in the book of Esther occurred while the Jews were in exile. Around the middle of the 5th century BC, some Jews had returned to the Promised Land, as we saw in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. However, many of the Jews remained in Babylon and in the Persian area, and such as stories of Daniel and Esther show us. The book of Esther is notable for its lack of reference to God. Now, the lack of reference to God is especially notable when we considering that the events in the book happened while the Jews were in exile in Persia. God's people had been for decades in a hostile environment, away from the promised land and without a temple. If they had spent many years learning how to be God's people with God dwelling in their midst, now they needed to learn how to be God's people away from the land, without the temple and surrounded by people with different beliefs. Some of the themes that we see in this book are themes like God protected his people when he appears to be absent. And God blesses courage and faithfulness in his people. God is faithful to his promises. And human wickedness is foolish, will not go unpunished. One key verse that we find in the book of Esther is in chapter 1, verses 14 through 16, where it says, "If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die." Who knows if perhaps you were made queen just for this at this time. Esther replies to Mordecai, "Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or night. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go and see the king. If I must die, I must die." The story revolves around 5 key people. There's, of course, King Xerxes, the Persian king, the son of Darius the First. He is the king in the book of Esther. We know about him that he invaded Greece but was later defeated by Greece. And it's reported that he was assassinated by members of his own court. Then we read briefly about Queen Vashti. She was the queen of Xerxes who loses her position as queen for disobeying the king's order. And then Mordecai, he is described as a son of Jair, a descendant of Saul, and he raises his cousin Esther. He prevents the assassination of the king and becomes one of the king's main advisors. And of course, Esther, who is the cousin of Mordecai. What we know about her is that she lost her parents and was raised by her cousin. In the course of events, she wins over the king to become queen at a very dangerous time. Her actions saved the Jews from extermination. Lastly, there's a villain in the story. His name is Haman. He was born of the royal line of the Amalekites, and he was one of the king's advisors. He plots the destruction of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. But yet things turn around, and he himself is hung on the gallows that he had prepared to hang Mordecai. What does it mean, then, to be God's people? God promises to be with his people. That promise that comes over and over again throughout Scripture. The book of Esther shows that although God is apparently absent in the story, his protection is ever present with his people. For us today, we are taught that faith is active. You see, God expects us to exercise our faith as Esther did, especially in times of danger, uncertainty, or suffering. The activity is not moved by blind faith, rather by a faith that knows God to be present, powerful, and willing to act on our behalf. How do we see Jesus in a book that does not even mention his name? Although God is not explicitly named in the book, his presence is unmistakable throughout the story. In our busy lives, we often go on living as if Jesus were not present in our lives. Yet as in Esther, he is ever present and interested in our lives. Thank you for joining our study on Echoes of Eternity, and especially through the books of history. In our next series, We'll be looking at the books of poetry and praise.
Holy words, long preserved for our walk in this world, they resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart